Despite its controversial ending overshadowing the series, Game of Thrones was truly groundbreaking, changing the TV landscape forever. The high-budget fantasy epic was better than any fantasy movie and made household names out of many of its actors. The best episodes of Game of Thrones explored more than just fantasy creatures, with the characters' political scheming being the central theme. Many Game of Thrones episodes are considered masterpieces, and they are not always the ones you expect. While the dragons and giants show off the show's enormous special effects budget, the more subtle or shocking episodes are generally the best. When it came to the business of politics and the shift of power, Game of Thrones was both insightful and extremely quotable. Power is power. Cersei Lannister. Cersei Lannister, Lena Headey, in a pink gown in Game of Thrones Season 1, Episode 5. In Game of Thrones' first season, we are still learning about the characters, their motivations, and the way that their world works. When Petter Littlefinger Baelish tells Queen Cersei Lannister that knowledge is power, this sounds insightful and mildly threatening to her. However, the scene becomes an intense battle of wits with Cersei proving otherwise. Cersei orders her guards to kill Littlefinger before changing her mind at the last minute, and tells him that power is power. In many situations, and definitely those in Westeros, this is true. Littlefinger's strength might have been in his methods for gaining knowledge and status, but this means nothing if you don't know when to act and when to wait. A small man can cast a very large shadow. Varys looking stern in Game of Thrones Season 7. Of all the characters who survived Game of Thrones, Tyrion Lannister is arguably the most iconic. When he and Varys have a discussion about riddles and the way in which people impact the world, Varys flatters Tyrion while being relevant outside the show. Peter Dinklage's portrayal of Tyrion is one of the best parts of Game of Thrones. The quote is genius in the context of the show, as many of the characters who both survive and thrive are not the expected ones. The underdogs like Sansa Stark and Tyrion Lannister have the best fates and strongest impact on the story by the end. Similarly, Varys' words often reflect real life, as small actions by everyday people can make a huge difference. Love is the death of duty. Maester Aemon Targaryen. Game of Thrones Maester Aemon looking over a balcony. The Targaryen family tree is complex, and Aemon Targaryen hides in plain sight as a member of the Night's Watch. When he explains to Jon Snow the reason behind the Brotherhood's vowed celibacy, he sums up one of the major themes of the show and highlights one character's unusual behavior. Ned Stark put his duty before love, while virtually every other character does not. Aemon Targaryen's line is the exact opposite of Jaime Lannister's, "The things I do for love," which ends the first episode and sets the events into motion. Even setting aside the incest angle, Jaime's choice to place his relationship with Cersei over his duty and Cersei's devotion to Joffrey, in turn, both prove Aemon to be right. Hodor looking up in Game of Thrones. Hodor first appears in the first season of Game of Thrones, where it is explained that Hodor is the only word he can say, following a childhood seizure. His death is one of the saddest side character deaths in Game of Thrones, and one of the biggest twists in the show, making his one word into a genius quote. As Bran walks into the childhood Hodor, whose name was originally Wireless, he links their minds. This leads to Wireless seeing his own death as Meera and Bran scream to "hold the door." As this phrase becomes Hodor, it reveals the tragic cause of the seizure as well as the reason behind Hodor's drastic change in demeanor. Know your strengths, use them wisely, and one man can be worth 10,000. Petter Littlefinger Baelish. Sansa looking at Littlefinger while they stand in an open field in Game of Thrones. Littlefinger might be a character who will lie and scheme to get what he wants, but occasionally, he comes out with something both true and insightful. When Littlefinger accompanies Sansa through the gorge to the Bloody Gate, he explains the strengths of the area to Sansa. It's a great example of a character using advice she has been given in their own way. When Sansa starts to play to her strengths, she becomes a more formidable opponent than others suspected, including Littlefinger himself. The advice is also excellent in general, outside of Game of Thrones. Using your strengths at the right time can be more valuable than brute force when trying to help people, especially in times of political unrest. Some people will always need help. That doesn't mean they're not worth helping. Meera Reed in Game of Thrones. Meera's quote is one of the best in Game of Thrones, which can be surprisingly reflective of real life, aside from the dragons. There are many powerful characters in Game of Thrones who have been underestimated because they have needed help at times. Both Bran and Sansa Stark are great examples, as are Daenerys Targaryen and Tyrion Lannister. That said, other characters, like Samwell Tarly, do not become powerful over time. Game of Thrones is about characters who all use different kinds of power to try and come out on top. This would usually mean that the needier characters get pushed aside, but Meera's quote highlights how these kinds of people should always be helped, even if they will always need it. When you tear out a man's tongue, you are not proving him a liar. You're only telling the world that you fear what he might say. Tyrion Lannister. Tyrion Lannister, Peter Dinklage, in Game of Thrones Season 1. Tyrion is unquestionably the most politically knowledgeable character in Game of Thrones. His words on censoring voices perfectly sum up the reasoning behind the actions of tyrant kings like Joffrey, as well as real-life political figures. That said, considering how the central themes of Game of Thrones deal with power and corruption, this quote is unusual as it only appears in the books. Some Game of Thrones characters are drastically different in the books, but Tyrion is one of the most accurate in terms of demeanor, if not looks. His commentary on silencing the voices of opponents would be perfectly in character for Peter Dinklage's Tyrion, and of all the great quotes that were left out of the TV show, this is the best.